So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction. We were looking at Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. So we'll just carry on from the point that we left last time. So we talked about how Razia's alienation, the wife of Septimus, Rezia's alienation is sort of doubly present, doubly experienced, because first of all she's Italian and so she finds herself completely alienated and cut off from London. And secondly, obviously, linguistically, culturally, she finds completely alienated. And she's also with a medically ill husband who is essentially alienated as well because of his trauma, which is suffering and experiencing all the time, which makes it impossible for him to connect to the rhythms of civilian life. And that disconnect also spills over into her. So that makes her doubly alienated. So, and the loneliness of Razia is something which is not quite talked about as often as it should be in this particular novel, but something that we should pay special attention to. In what way is she alienated? In what ways is she alienated? And how is the alienation actually more complex than that of Septimus or Mrs. Dalloway? So we just carry on from this point. There was nobody, this should be on the screen, there was nobody, her words faded, so a rocket fades. Its sparks, having grazed away into the night, surrendered to it. Dark descends, pours over the outlines of houses and towers. Bleak hillsides soften and fall in. But though they are gone, the night is full of them, robbed of color, blank of windows. They exist more ponderously, give out what the frank daylight fails to transmit. The trouble and suspense of things, conglomerated there in the darkness, huddled together in the darkness, reft of the relief which dawn brings when washing the walls white and grey, spotting each window pane, lifting the mist from the fields, showing the red-brown cows peacefully grazing, all its once more decked out to the eyes exists again. So what we see in this particular passage is the very interesting juxtaposition of loneliness and normalcy. But so everything looks very normal, but then the whole idea of the rocket descending and fading away is important because we see the use of military metaphors to describe the crisis of communication in this novel, which obviously goes to show how the war pervades the post-war London life and also how war pervades the language of post-war London. So every banal description, every domestic description, every commonplace description is peppered with military metaphors. So a rocket comes in as a metaphor over here. A rocket is something which comes, creates a lot of spark, and then fades away. So in the same way, words fade away, communication fades away. So the complete crisis of communication is seen as a bit of a collapse over here. And that collapse is very carefully juxtaposed to the seemingly okay, the seemingly functional signifiers, like the cow grazing, everything just moving on, the cows peacefully grazing, the window panes lifting up in the morning. So all these things which are seemingly functional actually makes the dysfunctionality more accentuated, right? So it's not a complete dysfunctionality. The dysfunctionality is surrounded by this signifiers the functionality, which make it even more dark, even more stark as a contrast. I am alone, she cried, by the fountain in a Regent's Park, staring at the Indian and its cross. And perhaps at midnight, when all boundaries are lost, the country reverts to its ancient shape as the Romans saw it, lying cloudy when they landed, and the hills had no names and rivers wound they knew not where. Such was the darkness. It's interesting how the whole idea of looking at England at the time when the Romans came in is something which we found even in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which we did in this course. So the whole idea of taking London back to a time before its imperial glory, before its modernity, and seen as a barbaric place of darkness when the Romans discovered and brought quote-unquote civilization to it. It's something which is obviously, it does various things, but first of all it shows us, it reflects that every civilization has been constructed at some point historically, and every civilization comes from an era of darkness, so to speak. Right, and obviously the whole idea of darkness is very politically motivated. It's very politically contingent. I mean, who defines what darkness is? Who defines if something is dark or not? Right, so these questions are laid bare before us. So today London is obviously blossoming as an imperial city, but now we also taken back to a time where, historically London was a place which was discovered by another set of imperialists, the Romans, at that point of time, right? And it almost has a mystic prehistoric quality about that description, which is something which you find even in Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Right? Now, interestingly, that darkness, that impregnable darkness, that inscrutable darkness is something which is compared to her darkness, right? So, you know, it's like everything is so mysterious, everything doesn't have any light in it, there's no rationale, there's no reason behind the darkness, which makes it even more inscrutable and impregnable as a condition, as a cognitive condition, right? So, such was her darkness. So you can see how Razia's existential darkness has been compared to the quote-unquote prehistoric darkness of London, the pre-imperial, prehistoric darkness of London, where no Western light of civilization had arrived, right? So the whole idea of the Western light, of course, is politically motivated and culturally constructed and consumed. So the whole idea of Western civilization is seen as tantamount or synonymous to civilization per se, right? So that lack of civilization, that pre-civilization London, is something which is compared to her darkness at this point of time. Such was the darkness, when suddenly, as if a shelf were shot forth and she stood on it, she said how she was his wife, married years ago in Milan, his wife, and would never, never tell that he was mad. Turning, the shelf fell. Down, down she dropped. For he was gone, she thought, gone as he threatened to kill himself, to throw himself under a cart. But no, there he was, still sitting alone on the seat in his shabby overcoat, his legs crossed, staring, talking aloud. Right, so this whole idea of this madman talking aloud in a busy metropolis becomes a very graphic symbol, a very graphic image of PTSD, or the post-traumatic stress disorder experienced by the war veteran who comes back from the war, but is unable to connect himself at any level to the metropolis. So he keeps talking to himself because he's the only person who understands himself, who understands his condition. And he ends up being a very ununderstood man, a very misunderstood man, an unaccommodated man. And this lack of accommodation, this alienation, is something which is physical, of course, but also it's quite cultural and existential. He cannot connect to anything that's going around him. So the post-war London rhythms don't touch him at all. Those ripples don't touch him at all. So he's still transported, he's still fixed in the trauma of the war. He hasn't, in other words, moved on temporally or spatially or spatio-temporally. He's still fixated to the trauma, which is the trench trauma that he's experienced as a war veteran. But coming back to London post-war, he's unable to move on, he's unable to make connections, he's unable to recognize any cultural functionality that London is exhibiting at this point of time. Okay, so and now we have the first reference to Yvonnes in this passage. Now, Yvonnes is someone who is presumably Septimus's friend who had died in the war. Now, Yvonnes is a very important spectral presence in Mrs. Dalloway, right? So he's someone who is there as some kind of a shadowy, ghostly figure. He represents the everyman who died in the war, but also, more specifically, he also represents the relationship that Septimus may have developed during the war. And there's a lot of war scholarship which tells us how in that very claustrophobic space of the trench, they also develop, along with the dread and phobia and the trauma, they also develop this need for mutual intimacy with the soldiers, among the soldiers. And that intimacy in the trenches, that intimacy in the very close spaces could often spill over, could often extend into erotic intimacy, into sexual relationships, which are never quite spelled out. So in this novel, it's never quite clear whether Yvonnes and Septimus had a sexual relationship. And maybe they did. But this whole idea of Yvonnes is someone who's conjured up over and over again by Septimus. And of course, Septimus suffers from what we call survivor's guilt, the fact that he survived the war and Yvonnes did not. All that comes together to accentuate the complexity of the relationship. It could be erotic, it could be existential, it is definitely very deeply emotional, and that emotionality of the relationship is something which is underlined over and over again. So in other words, the intimacy that Septimus had with Yvonnes is something which is lost forever now with the death of Yvonnes. And along with that, what is also lost is Septimus's ability to be intimate, Septimus's ability to be understood, to be loved, to express empathy, right? So this empathy-lessness is something which Mrs. Dalloway is entirely all about. No one understands anyone in Mrs. Dalloway. And this lack of understanding, this lack of empathy is something which makes this particular novel such a traumatic novel, right? So it's a novel about trauma, a novel about a post-war trauma, London, which looks very functional, which looks full of velocity. Vehicles of velocity are there. There are omnibuses, there are trains, there's metro, there's all these things are moving very fast and quickly, seemingly speaking. But beneath all that, sheen of violence, what we actually get is a very deep-seated trauma, this inability to move on. And this inability to move on is something which transfixes people, especially Septimus, who comes back from the war as a trauma victim, someone who cannot move on, someone who finds this philosophy intimidating, someone who finds the philosophy alienating at many, many levels. And of course, the medical scene makes it more tyrannical. The medical scene refuses to see Septimus as anyone who suffers for anything. And we are told repeatedly that Mr. Holmes, or Dr. Holmes, and it's interesting how Woolf chooses the name Dr. Holmes, because he represents the obvious illusion is this hyper-masculine rationalist self who seems to know everything and deduct everything, etc. Now he seems to say, or he decides to Septimus, so to speak, that nothing is really the matter with him. And that is something which is conveyed to Razia, something which Razia is almost increasingly getting convinced about, right? And this idea of there's nothing is wrong with him, he needs to introspect less, he needs to be less narcissistic, is something which is told to our veterans over and over again, because empirically speaking, materially speaking, somatically speaking, there's nothing wrong with them. There's no bodily injury. But that was the whole point. The trauma was actually deep-seated. The trauma was in the subconscious, and hence we have these visions of dead soldiers which are haunting them all the time. Okay, and so the whole allusion to Yvonnes is interesting, and this should be on the screen. There was his hand, there the dead. White things were assembling behind the railings opposite, but it dared not look. Yvonnes was behind the railings. So this is a classic PTSD trigger, a post-traumatic stress disorder trigger, because what he sees across the railings are normal people, living people, city people, moving people. But what he sees actually amongst all these living and moving and functional people are dead soldiers, people who died with him, the dead comrades. And obviously that hallucination, that image evokes guilt in his mind, that image evokes trauma in his mind, but also it completely shakes him for any kind of connect to the reality around him. In other words, Septimus over here, he inhabits a different order of reality. He inhabits a different order of embodiment, which is not in sync with the normative order of reality around him. The normative order is something else. He lives in a different bubble altogether, and the two orders of space-time are completely out of sync. Septimus is, among other things, someone who's completely out of sync, someone who's completely incompatible with the rhythms, with the very compulsive rhythms of a post-war metropolis. Okay, what are you saying? Said Razia, suddenly sitting down by him. Interrupted again. She was always interrupting, and the word interruption is important because, as I mentioned already, Septimus is what we might describe as someone exhibiting interrupted embodiment. His sense of embodiment, his sense of language, his sense of recognition, his sense of cognition, his sense of physicality, his sense of ego, everything has got interrupted. And that interruption is obviously very, very politically produced, because part of the interruption is also because of lack of understanding. He's not understood by the medical practitioners, he's not understood by the civilians around him, and they all refuse to see him as a war hero. There is a sense of shame that he inhabits, that he embodies with his trauma, and all that come together to interrupt his embodiment, and that's something which we find about Septimus quite pervasively. Okay. Away from people. They must get away from people. He said, jumping up. So he's very, very jumpy. He's a nervous wreck. He's a bunch of nerves. He's always jumpy. He's always edgy. He always wants to get away from people. He's obviously very antisocial now, and he finds it difficult, almost impossible, to socialize with people, to connect to people at any level. So away from people. They must get away from people. He said, jumping up. Right away from over there, where there are chairs beneath a tree, and a long slope of the park dipped like a length of green stuff, with a ceiling cloth of blue and pink smoke high above. And there was a rampart of far irregular houses, haze and smoke. The traffic hummed in a circle, and on the right, dun-coloured animals stretched long necks over the zoo palings, barking, howling. There they sat down under a tree. So again, look at the signifiers of seeming functionality, the zoo, the people getting in, the houses which are in order, there are cars which are moving, but amidst all this functionality, amidst all this superficiality of functionality, we have this deep-seated dysfunctionality which is inhabited and embodied by Septimus. Okay. And then, of course, we have this entire effort made by Razia to make Septimus look at things, right? Look outside of himself, because that's what the doctor had told her. Make him look outside of himself, because he, according to the doctors like Holmes and Bradshaw, he suffers from morbid over-introspection. He suffers from morbid narcissistic and neurotic over-introspection. That's something which must be gotten rid of, according to the doctors. So he must be asked to look out of himself. And this idea of looking out is important, because that will presumably make him more social, right? And that sociality is important important for Septimus to re-establish himself as a social person, as a connected person to the rhythms of modern life. Look, she implored him, pointing at the little troop of boys carrying cricket stumps, and one shuffled, spun around on his heel and shuffled as if he were acting a clown at the music hall. So this is a very interesting image, a group of boys walking with cricket stumps. So cricket is obviously a very male imperial sport at this point of time. However, within this cricket team that is being seen over here, one of the guys spins around with his heel and shuffles as if he were acting as a clown at the music hall. So again, look at the very complex masculinity at play. We have a group of boys presumably headed for a cricket match, coming back from a cricket match. They have cricket kit with them, and inside the cricket arrangement we have someone acting like a clown, which is obviously undercutting the entire cricket masculinity that is being presumably presented by this image, collectively speaking. Look, she implored him, for Dr. Holmes had told her to make him notice real things, to go to the music hall, play cricket. That was a very game, Dr. Holmes said, a nice outdoor game, the very game for a husband. Again, so look at the cricket, the metaphor of cricket is important over here. Cricket is an imperial sport, cricket is a manly sport, cricket is a collective sport. It'll give you a team spirit, it'll give you manliness. It's obviously an extension of the imperial legacy. As all of you would know, it was a classic imperial game, and that's something which is introduced in the colonies. So cricket is advocated and prescribed for Septimus over here as a collective manly sport, which will re-engineer back him back into the normative order of masculinity, right? So that's an important metaphor at work. So the doctor actually asks him to play cricket, because cricket will also be re-establishing, re-engineering him into the desirable model of masculinity, into the normative order of masculinity, of which he's fallen off from. And so he's become dysfunctional and incompatible with that normative order of masculinity. So the whole idea is to make him normative again, is to make him compatible again to this whole idea of the cricketing man, the cricketing manly man. Okay. Look, she repeated. So she keeps telling him to look, and obviously the implication is he does not look. He's not concerned with anything outside of himself, which is making him more and more, quote-unquote, pathological, according to the doctors. The fact that he refuses to see anything outside of himself, because he cannot see anything outside of himself, because he's so full of trauma, he's so submerged in trauma, he's so ununderstood, and so he's so living his trauma, reliving, re-experiencing his trauma all the time, that it's completely impossible for him to look outside of himself into any objective order of reality, right? So in other words, he's inhabiting a different order of reality, which is obviously hallucinatory, which is imaginative, which is completely traumatophilic. It's a traumatic landscape of reality that Septimus is inhabiting, right? And he refuses to step out of that reality, step out of the landscape, and look at things as they are functioning around him at a very superficial level. Okay, look, the unseen bade him. So again, Razia is the unseen, the unheard, the unseen. So her loneliness is actually more accentuated, as I may have mentioned already. So we have different orders of loneliness at crisscross with each other. Right, so look, the unseen bade him, the voice which now communicated with him, who was the greatest of mankind, Septimus, lately taken from life to death, the Lord who came to renew society, who lay like a coverlet, a snow blanket smitten only by the sun, forever unwasted, suffering forever, the scapegoat, the eternal sufferer, but did not want to. He moaned, putting from him with a wave of his hand the eternal suffering, that eternal loneliness. So again, the whole idea of Septimus being the archetypal lonely man is interesting, because he represents that lonely man who returns from somewhere and is never understood subsequently. We saw the figure in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We see that in romantic poetry as well, especially in Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The ancient mariner comes back from a very complex situation, existential situation, and he cannot tell a story to anyone else. So this whole archetype of this ununderstood storyteller is important in literature, and Septimus obviously is part of that legacy. Okay, look, she repeated, for he must not talk aloud to himself out of doors. So he must not be seen talking to himself in the public, because that will be seen as a marker of insanity, a marker of rationality, a marker of madness, according to Dr. Holmes and Bradshaw. Oh, look, she implored him. But what was there to look at? A few sheep, that was all. The way to Regent's Park Tube Station. Could they tell her way to Regent's Park Tube Station? Maisie Johnson wanted to know. She was only out from Edinburgh 2 days ago. Not this way, over there, Razia exclaimed, waving her aside, lest she should see Septimus. Both seemed queer, Maisie Johnson thought. Everything seemed very queer. In London for the first time, come to take up the post of uncles in Leadenhall Street, and now walking through Regent's Park in the morning, this couple on the chairs gave her quite a turn. The young woman seeming foreign, the man looking queer, so that she should be very old, she should still remember and make it jangle again and among memories, how she had walked to Regent's Park on a fine summer's morning 50 years ago, for she was only 19 and had got away at last to come to London. And now how queer it was, this couple she had asked the way off, and the girl started and jerked her hand, and the man, he seemed awfully odd, quarrelling, perhaps parting forever, perhaps something was up, she knew, and now all these people she returned to the Broad Walk, the stone basins, the prim flowers, the old men and women, invalids most of them in bath chairs, all seemed after Elizabeth of Edinburgh so queer. Now see, the word queer comes back almost 5 times, and it can mean a whole host of things. Obviously it means strange, but it can also take up a modern homoerotic overtones. It can be a reference to Septimus's covert homosexuality that he displayed towards Yvonnes. That's not spelled out there, and the word queer in that kind of parlance was introduced much later, that took up that currency much later. It wasn't there at that point of time. But the whole point is that looking at London from a different perspective. We have this Scottish woman, Maisie Johnson, comes from Edinburgh. For her, London is an aspirational space, a space for aspiration, a space for possibilities, a space for new openings. And now she runs across this very queer couple. The girl looks very, very foreign now. Obviously, Rezia is Italian. She looks like an outsider to London. And the man looks so queer. The man looks so outdated. And then she comes across old men and women, invalids, most of them in bath corners and bath chairs. Again, the whole idea of looking at London as a group of people who are invalid and old, that obviously shows the post-war demography in order. So this is a London where there's no able-bodied young men left. The able-bodied young men are either dead or mad or bruised to a point beyond recognition. So all we have are mad young men and disabled old men, because that's what the war did to the demography of London to a large extent. So looking at London, this particular episode, and Maisie Johnson is a seemingly unimportant character, but what she offers in this episode is a new look at London, a new perspective of London, coming from Scotland, coming from Edinburgh. And London, obviously, to her, is a space for aspiration, a space for triumph, a space for new openings, a space for victory. This will open up new things for her. But she finds London quite queer at this point in time. The word queer is repeated 5 times over and over again, which obviously tells you something. Okay, Maisie Johnson positively felt she must cry. Oh, for the young man on the seat had given her quite a turn. Something was up, she knew. So there's something about Septimus over here which is slightly zombie-like in quality. There's something undead about him, dead as well as undead. So he inhabits that liminal space between deadness and life. And that's something which shakes Maisie Johnson, who's coming to London as a naive Scottish woman. And he sees London, he had this idea of London as this opening space, as a wonderful space, as an aspirational space. And suddenly she finds completely claustrophobic and almost traumatized, almost started to the point of trauma. And this is where a point that she says, horror, horror, she wanted to cry. She had left her people. They had warned her what would happen. So again, the whole idea of come to London against the warning, despite the warning of her Scottish relatives, is something which is horrifying him at this point of time. And the recognition why she hadn't stayed at home, she cried, twisting the knob of the iron railing. So this regret of coming to London, why she hadn't stayed at home, is something she's regretting. So again, London over here becomes a very complex space of aspiration, regret, mourning, and trauma. And this very seemingly unimportant character, Scottish young woman, 19-year-old Maisie Johnson, come to London with possibilities and aspirations and getting decimated at so many levels, looking at the post-war people, is something that we must take into account as a very, very graphic image of violence, mourning, and trauma. So stop at this point today. We'll continue with this text in our next lecture. Thank you for your attention.